Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're really kind of stepping into a pretty unique area. And
Yeah.
it's one that I think, we both find fascinating, but might be a little unfamiliar to some listeners. So you ready to put on our philosophy hats?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to dive into this. You brought some really rich and really interesting material.
Yeah, you really have. It's a whole world of thought, and it's really about contemporary Africana philosophy. So, we're gonna try to unpack what that even means, highlight some of the key ideas and thinkers, and hopefully show everyone why this stuff really matters.
Yeah, and just to kind of get us started right off the bat, one of the things that really stands out about Africana philosophy is that it demands a certain kind of engagement. It's not just about passively absorbing ideas.
Right.
It's about actively thinking with and through them. And a great place to start is with Lewis R. Gordon's definition. He describes it as an area of philosophical research that addresses the problems faced and raised by the African diaspora.
That's a really powerful way to frame it because right away you can see these two really crucial elements. One is this sense of Africanity. It's about recognizing the deep connections and shared experiences that link people across the African continent and its diaspora.
Right, absolutely. And that deep sense of connection and shared history really informs everything else.
Yeah. And then alongside that, you have this idea of problematicity. And that's really about, directly confronting the unique challenges, the questions, the whole set of issues that arise specifically from that experience.
Yeah, it's about grappling with really, really difficult questions
Yeah.
and not shying away from them.
Mm.
And to sort of deepen that idea of, how this field of thought operates,
Hmm.
we can turn to Lucius T. Outlaw Jr. He talks about Africana philosophy as a third-order metaphilosophical umbrella concept. Now, that might sound a little intimidating,
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
but what it really means is that we're dealing with this incredibly broad and rich field of inquiry, one that's grown out of very specific historical and social circumstances. And that takes the lived realities of the people who are most affected by those circumstances incredibly seriously.
And I think that's a key point, right? It's taking lived experience and making that central to philosophical inquiry.
Precisely. It's not just about abstract ideas. It's about how those ideas connect to real lives and struggles.
Yeah. And so, you see these recurring themes that emerge naturally from that focus. It's not surprising, right? When you're engaging with such a profound set of experiences, certain questions and ideas are going to come up again and again.
Absolutely. And I think to really understand those themes, it's helpful to look at the sort of foundational context, the background against which all of this is happening. So we've got a few key factors here. One is coloniality,
Hmm.
and that refers to the incredibly powerful and long-lasting impact of epistemic imperialism, right? For centuries, European ways of knowing were presented as the only legitimate ones.
Yeah, the only truth, the only way to even think about the world.
Right. And this often came at the expense of other very rich intellectual traditions, including, of course, those from Africa and the diaspora.
So it's like silencing entire ways of seeing and understanding the world.
Precisely. And then you have heterodoxy, which is the fact that so much of the really important groundbreaking work in Africana philosophy actually happened outside of those traditional mainstream, European influenced institutions.
Right. It was happening on the margins in spaces that were often ignored or dismissed by the academic establishment.
Exactly. And finally, you have historicity. And that emphasizes this deep understanding that the development of Africana philosophy can't be separated from the actual lived, social and political realities that people in the diaspora were facing. It's deeply intertwined with history.
So we're not dealing with abstract theory here. We're dealing with a living, breathing intellectual tradition, and it's one that's directly connected to the experience of oppression, resistance, and the struggle for liberation.
Absolutely. It's incredibly dynamic and always evolving. So, as we start to dig into some of the key themes and thinkers, I think it's important to keep all of that context in mind.
Yeah, it really shapes everything. So, to kind of kick things off, let's talk about those initial sort of core themes, the ideas that really emerged from this unique condition of Africanity, as you put it. I mean, where do we even begin?
Well, I think one of the most fundamental and really compelling themes is philosophical anthropology.
Hmm.
And it makes sense when you think about it, right? When the very definition of what it means to be human has been denied or distorted, as it so often has been for people of African descent, then the question, what is human, becomes incredibly urgent. It becomes a central philosophical question.
It's such a powerful point, right? Because in a lot of philosophical traditions, the human is just kind of taken for granted. It's this assumed starting point. But here, that very category is up for debate.
Exactly. The whole idea of what constitutes a human being, what defines humanity, has to be re-examined.
Yeah.
It has to be grappled with in light of these experiences of dehumanization and oppression.
And closely tied to that is the theme of liberation.
Hmm.
And it's really important to understand what that means in this context, right? Because it's not just about achieving political freedom, it goes much deeper than that.
Right. It's about this really profound ethical and existential struggle against all forms of oppression. And a big part of that is understanding what it truly means to be free in your being, in your consciousness, when you're living under oppressive systems, when your very humanity is being denied.
Yeah. And then you have these meta reflections on reason. I mean, think about all of the historical stereotypes that painted African people as irrational, as somehow lacking in intellectual capacity. This theme directly challenges that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It involves this really critical examination of the very concept of reason. Right. Because who gets to decide what counts as rational thought? Whose perspective is being privileged? So it's about challenging those biased assumptions and reclaiming intellectual authority on their own terms.
It's really about deconstructing those power dynamics, that have shaped how we think about knowledge and intelligence.
Exactly. And all that feeds directly into the themes of identity and self-consciousness. Because when the dominant narratives constantly misrepresent you or invalidate your experiences, the journey to truly knowing yourself, to having a strong and secure sense of who you are, becomes incredibly difficult.
Yeah, you're constantly bombarded with these external messages that are telling you who you are or who you should be.
Right. So it raises this very profound question. How do you achieve genuine self-knowledge, a true understanding of your own identity in the face of such profound epistemic injustice? It's a huge challenge.
And another key theme, I think, one that's really unique to Africana philosophy, is what's called theoretical archaeology. And I love that term, right? It's like you're on an intellectual excavation.
It is. It's perfect. Drawing on Dawson's work here, it's the active process of uncovering, bringing to light and valuing all of those often overlooked contributions of African-descended people and cultures, the ones that have been, deliberately erased or simply ignored by the dominant historical narratives.
Yeah, it's like filling in those gaps in our understanding of intellectual history.
Exactly. And Lucius Outlaw Jr. really emphasizes how essential this recovery work is for a more complete understanding of philosophical thought itself. Because without it, we're missing huge pieces of the puzzle.
And then finally, we have this idea of philosophy born of struggle. And I think this is a really powerful concept. Outlaw, who's really following in the footsteps of thinkers like Leonard Harris and even Frederick Douglass, points out that for many Africana philosophers, the act of thinking, doing philosophy, it's not some detached academic exercise. It's a direct response to very real and often urgent life problems.
Absolutely. It's about grappling with issues of injustice, of oppression, of survival. It's about using philosophy as a tool to make sense of the world, to resist those forces, to work towards liberation.
It's really powerful stuff, and it reminds us that, ideas aren't just floating around in some abstract realm. They're deeply connected to people's lives and experiences, especially the experiences of struggle and resistance.
Right. And I think these initial themes really lay the groundwork for understanding the core concerns of Africana philosophy. Now, it's important to remember that while there are these strong common threads, these shared experiences and questions, Africana philosophy isn't monolithic. It's not a single unified thing.
Right. It's not like there's one right way to do Africana philosophy.
Exactly. And that's because, different regional histories and experiences, those shape how these themes are approached.
Yeah, different parts of the African diaspora have been through very different things, even though there's that shared root.
Right. So broadly speaking, we can look at continental Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas as three sort of key regions. And while the shared experience of Africanity leads to those thematic continuities that we've been talking about, the significance of African roots, the role of violence, in liberation movements, the importance of intersectionality, the whole goal of decolonization.
Right.
And the specific ways those themes are approached, that can differ quite a bit.
Yeah, like the same question can have a very different resonance depending on where you're standing, right?
Yeah, precisely. So let's take the question of the modern as a clear example. On the African continent, philosophical engagement often centered around the relationship between modernity and tradition. Is modernity the path to progress? How do you navigate the complexities of tradition in the face of rapid advancements.
Yeah. It's that tension between holding on to what's valuable from the past and embracing what's new, right?
Exactly. And then you move to the Caribbean, and the experience of modernity is quite different. It's fundamentally shaped by the history of, forced migration and colonization, by this brutal collision of cultures.
Right. It's a whole different set of circumstances.
Absolutely. So thinkers in the Caribbean are grappling with the legacy of that violent encounter. And Edouard Glissant, he's this really fascinating concept of creolité.
Yeah, I heard that term.
It's this idea that Caribbean identity is constantly evolving, it's hybrid, it's formed in the wake of that collision. So the focus shifts from this idea of a potentially, idealized tradition to this incredibly dynamic, ever-changing reality of a post-colonial world.
And that fluidity, that mixing, it really challenges the whole colonial project, which was all about rigid categories, right?
Exactly, exactly. And then in the Americas, the central issues often revolved around racial uplift, around integration within those existing societal structures,
Yeah.
however unequal they might be.
Right. So it's about trying to carve out a space within a system that's fundamentally unjust.
Yeah, and the whole conversation about tradition often became really intertwined with the struggle for civil rights and equality.
Okay, so we've got these different regional nuances, right? And I think
Mm,
it's really important to keep that in mind because it just shows how rich and diverse Africana philosophy really is.
absolutely. It's not this one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah.
So now let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about how this whole vibrant field of inquiry made its way into, academia, how it became a more formally recognized and consolidated area of study.
Okay, yeah. So we're talking about that transition to the universities, right? Like when did that really start to happen?
Well, it really started to gain traction in the mid to late 20th century. We see figures like Kwasi Wiredu. He pointed out this growing presence of African academics, in universities and institutions, especially in the post-independence era. And then you have Lucius Outlaw Jr., and he emphasizes the crucial role of those successive generations of scholars, the ones who came after, entered the profession, and really began to organize and create these networks of intellectual exchange.
So it's about building institutions, right? It's about creating spaces where these ideas can be discussed and debated.
Exactly. And this movement really started to take off in the 1980s. That decade saw the publication of several really foundational works, books that really helped to establish the field.
So like what are we talking about? What are some of those key texts?
Well, you have, Richard A. Wright's African Philosophy, an introduction. That was huge, just in terms of laying out the groundwork. And then you have Cornel West, his incredibly powerful book, Prophesy Deliverance, Angela Davis's groundbreaking Women, Race, and Class, which is still so relevant today. The first edition of Leonard Harris's influential Philosophy Born of Struggle.
These are all big names, big thinkers.
Yeah, and they were really shaping the discourse. Then you have V.Y. Mudimbe, is really insightful, The Invention of Africa, and of course, Edouard Glissant's Caribbean Discourses. And all of these books together, they created this solid foundation for the field to build upon.
Wow, so the 80s were a really fertile period.
They were. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, you see this further consolidation. There's this new wave of scholars producing incredibly influential work that reached a wider audience.
Okay, so who are we talking about here? Give us some names.
You have, Kwame Anthony Appiah, his really important book, In My Father's House. Charles W. Mills with his absolutely essential The Racial Contract. Lucius T. Outlaw Jr. with On Race and Philosophy. Lewis R. Gordon's really compelling Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism.
Wow, this is like a who's who of contemporary Africana philosophy.
It is. And we've also got Paget Henry, his really thought-provoking Caliban's Reason. Kwame Geki with his really nuanced Tradition of Modernity. Patricia Hill Collins' now classic Black feminist thought. Bernard R. Boxall's incredibly significant Blacks and Social Justice. So all of these thinkers, they were really shaping the discourse, pushing the boundaries of the field and bringing it to a wider audience.
And what I find so interesting is how a lot of these Africana philosophers, they were engaging with, the more established mainstream schools of thought, but it wasn't just about taking those existing philosophical tools and, applying them to new topics. It was something much more dynamic and creative than that.
Exactly. The source uses this great analogy. It calls it riffing. It's like, taking those established melodies, those familiar philosophical frameworks, and improvising on them, bringing in these fresh perspectives, these new insights, and in the process, fundamentally transforming those traditions.
I love that analogy. So can you give us some concrete examples of this riffing in action? Like, how did these Africana philosophers actually engage with those mainstream schools?
Sure. So you have Angela Davis and Lucius Outlaw Jr., for example, and they engage really deeply with critical theory, bringing those unique perspectives rooted in the experiences of the African diaspora to its frameworks.
Right.
And in doing so, they enriched and expanded its scope.
Right. They were showing how those critical tools could be used to analyze race and racism in ways that the traditional theorists hadn't necessarily done.
Exactly. Then you have Cornel West and Leonard Harris, and they were drawing from the American tradition of pragmatism.
Okay, so how did they sort of riff on that?
Well, they took that pragmatist focus on experience, and social critique, and adapted it to address the specific concerns of Africana communities.
So it's about grounding those philosophical ideas in the lived realities of people, right?
Absolutely. And then you have UMR Dimbe and Edouard Glissant, and they engaged really creatively with post-structuralist ideas.
Mm.
They were using those ideas to analyze, the construction of knowledge and identity in colonial and post-colonial contexts, to really understand how power shapes our understanding of the world.
Right, it's about deconstructing those narratives, those dominant ways of seeing things.
Exactly. And then you have Louis R. Gordon and Paget Henry, and they developed a distinct Africana form of existential phenomenology. And that's building on those core tenets of phenomenology, but exploring the lived experiences of Black subjectivity in a really profound way.
So it's about understanding the world from a very specific perspective, one that's rooted in those experiences of Blackness.
Right. And finally, you have Kwame Anthony Appiah and Bernard R. Boxill, and they really brought Africana ethical and political thought into conversation with those rigorous methods of analytic philosophy.
Hmm.
So you see this incredible range of engagement, this dynamic interplay between Africana thought and these established traditions, and that really helped to propel the field forward.
It's like this ongoing conversation, right? Where these different ideas are bouncing off of each other and creating something new in the process.
Precisely. So, now that we have that solid foundation, I think it's really important to see how contemporary Africana philosophy is continuing to build upon it. And the source outlines, four kind of broad structural trends that we're seeing.
Okay, so let's walk through those. What's the first one?
Well, the first one is all about fortifying and expanding the established resources of the field. And this is happening in two main ways. First, there's what we might call the tentpole approach, which is all about, deepening our understanding of those really iconic foundational figures.
Like the giants, the ones who laid the groundwork.
Exactly. So think Cooper, Dubois, Fanon, those key figures. And we're seeing scholars like Robert Gooding Williams, who's doing this really significant work, re-examining the philosophical contributions of W.E. Du Bois.
So it's about going back and rereading, those classic texts with fresh eyes, finding new insights.
Right. And then alongside that, there's this expansionist trend, which is about bringing to the forefront other incredibly important thinkers, figures who haven't always received that same level of philosophical attention.
So who are we talking about here?
Well, think of figures like James Baldwin, Martin Luther King Jr., Lorraine Hansberry, Audre Lorde, all of these incredibly influential voices. And you have scholars like Brandon Terry doing really crucial work on King, Soyika Colbert on Hansberry. And it's not just about individual thinkers, it's also about recovering the work of individuals who are in dialogue with those icons, right? So like Brittany Cooper's scholarship on Fanny Barrier Williams, for example, that's really important. And then you have the rediscovery of, those previously neglected academic philosophers, scholars like McClendon III and Ferguson II, for example, who are doing really important work.
So it's about both, going deeper with the recognized giants, but also broadening the scope to include these other essential voices. I love that. So what's the second structural element?
Okay, so the second one is the transformation of those existing philosophical schools and movements through the lens of Africana thought. And we touched on this riffing idea earlier, right? And it's an ongoing process. It's constantly evolving. You see scholars who are really creatively reinventing those mainstream traditions, incorporating those insights from Africana thought in really interesting ways.
So it's not just about adding on to those existing traditions. It's about fundamentally changing them from the inside out.
Exactly. And Lewis Gordon's development of Africana existential phenomenology, that's a prime example of how those Africana perspectives can reshape a major philosophical approach.
Yeah, and we're seeing something similar with the emergence of what's called African-American pragmatism, right?
Yeah.
Building on the work of West and Harris.
Right, exactly. And that's another compelling example. And then, more broadly, you have this increasing engagement of what's called African-American analytical philosophy with Africana themes. And that's happening across all sorts of different subfields. ethics, political thought, aesthetics, epistemology, philosophy of language. It's really demonstrating that Africana philosophy isn't just this, separate area. It's actively contributing to and transforming the broader philosophical landscape.
So it's really breaking down those boundaries, showing how these ideas are relevant across the board.
Precisely. Now, the third structural shift is really about a broadening of geographical focus. It's about moving beyond that traditional, three-part division of the continent, the Caribbean, and the Americas.
So opening up the conversation to include more voices, more perspectives.
Exactly. So there's this increasing recognition of the Africana philosophical thought happening in other parts of the world. And we're seeing scholarship on, Canadian Africana philosophy and the study of the African diaspora in Europe. And there's also this really important and, complex engagement with the question of Africa's white inhabitants.
So we're not just talking about people of African descent anymore.
Right. It's also about those whose families have lived on the continent for generations. Their identities and futures are tied to it in really complex ways. And Samantha Weiss's essay, that's a significant contribution to that conversation, one that's often really difficult but incredibly important. It's raising those crucial ethical and political questions.
So the field is becoming, more globally aware and nuanced in its understanding of the different experiences within the diaspora.
I like that. Okay, so now, what about those key themes? How are they evolving in contemporary Africana philosophy? Right. Well, one of the most dynamic and really complex areas is the study of gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
And while it's maybe not as established as some of those other core areas, it's definitely an area of increasing scholarly attention.
And there's so much to unpack there, right? So many different perspectives and experiences.
Absolutely. Thinkers are really grappling with a wide range of issues, often drawing on, and critically engaging with foundational texts and thinkers from those earlier periods. Patricia Hill Collins's Black Feminist Thought, that's a really influential text in this area.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like that book has had a huge impact.
It has, and the recent anniversary symposium, that really highlighted the ongoing relevance of her work, especially her analysis of how race, class, and gender, those things are all interconnected.
Right, they can't be separated.
Exactly. And so scholars like Christy Dotson are building upon her work to develop a political epistemology that really addresses that historical exclusion of, Black feminist thought from mainstream philosophy. And then you have Catherine Bell, who's focusing on those existential and phenomenological dimensions of Collins's work, really emphasizing that importance of, safe spaces and community building. And her work with the Collegium for Black Women Philosophers, that's a great example of that in action.
So it's about creating those supportive environments where these ideas can flourish.
Absolutely. And then in terms of, perspectives on gender and sexuality from the African continent itself, Oyeronke Oyewumi, the Nigerian sociologist, she's a really important figure.
I've heard of her work.
Yeah. Her book, The Invention of Women, that sparked a lot of debate and discussion. Her argument that gender as this, rigid binary, it's not a foundational organizing principle in, Yorubaland, that's really challenged those Western assumptions.
Right. It's pushing us to think outside of those traditional categories.
Exactly. And while her work has faced some criticism, it remains this really crucial point of reference for understanding those diverse perspectives on gender.
And we can't talk about gender and sexuality without mentioning intersectionality, right? That concept that Kimberly Crenshaw developed.
For sure. That framework. Yeah, understanding how multiple social categories like race and gender intersect to create those unique experiences of oppression that's had this huge impact across, tons of different disciplines, and continues to be this really rich area of philosophical inquiry, raising those fundamental questions about identity, about complexity, about the possibilities for coalition building.
It's about recognizing that people's experiences are shaped by multiple factors, right? And that those factors interact in complex ways.
Precisely. And, the source also points out something really interesting. It says that there's been a relative lack of direct engagement with, queer theory within Africana philosophy itself.
So there's still work to be done there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dwight McBride's call for this, new Black studies, one that more intentionally addresses, intraracial diversity, including those issues of sexual orientation and gender identity, that's really relevant here. But there's some really promising work happening. V. Denise James and Anika Simpson, they're engaging directly with, queer theory in relation to Africana experiences, so that's a really encouraging development.
It's exciting to see those new voices and perspectives coming in.
It is. Now, another evolving theme that we see is what's being called critical ethnophilosophy. And this is a way of thoughtfully engaging with those traditional African systems of thought.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly? Like, what's the critical part about?
Well, the initial critique of, ethnophilosophy came from thinkers like Hautaunagi and Hallen. And they were concerned about the tendency to, present communal, often past-oriented thought without really rigorous argumentation.
So they felt like it wasn't really philosophy in a strict sense?
Right? They had some concerns about the methodology. But the concept has been reclaimed and kind of refigured as critical ethnophilosophy by scholars like Paget Henry and Kwame Anthony Appiah. And the goal here is to carefully excavate those valuable philosophical insights from, Africana cultures and bring them into conversation with those contemporary debates, but to do it with a critical lens, to avoid romanticizing or essentializing.
So it's about being rigorous, right? About holding those ideas up to scrutiny.
Exactly. And we're seeing some really interesting examples of this in contemporary work. People are bringing African philosophical concepts like Ubuntu or, calm proverbs, the Yoruba conception of peace, even those African-derived spiritual practices like hoodoo love rituals.
Wow, so it's a really wide range of engagement.
It is. And the ongoing debates around, the study of Ubuntu in South Africa, those highlight some of the complexities involved in this work,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to the role of white philosophers and the potential for reproducing those existing power dynamics.
Right. There are always ethical considerations when you're dealing with different cultures and knowledge systems.
Absolutely. Now, the theme of political thought in context, that's been a really consistent and central focus in Africana philosophy. And it makes sense, given its origins in the struggle against oppression.
Right, like those political concerns are baked into the very DNA of the field.
Exactly. And while philosophical commentary on those iconic figures, like Nkrumah, Azikiwe, Dubois, Cooper, Senghor, Césaire, that continues to be really important. The range of thinkers and concerns has definitely expanded.
So it's becoming even more nuanced and diverse.
It is. Post-independence African philosophy itself has gone through these really interesting shifts, moving from those early debates about ethnophilosophy in the 1970s to critiques of, cultural production in the 1980s, and then, to theorizing the crises of those post-colonial states in the 1990s.
So reflecting those changing political realities.
Absolutely. And we've also seen this emergence of new theories and concepts, like Afropolitanism and those really critical analyses of the medical model that often gets used in social theorizing. Charles Mills and Tommy Shelby, their work is particularly influential here. They both advocate for these Black radical approaches to political theory.
So pushing the boundaries of those traditional frameworks.
Exactly. And they do it in really interesting ways, creatively engaging with, both Africana intellectual traditions and those mainstream political philosophies.
Right.
So you have Mills with his reexamination of the social contract, for example, and Shelby with his engagement with, Rollgian theory and Black nationalism.
Wow, so there's a lot going on in that area.
There is. It's really vibrant and dynamic. Now, I think the last theme, and maybe the most fundamental in a lot of ways, is this idea of Black life and social death. And this really speaks to that ongoing engagement with, problematicity at its core.
Right. It's about confronting those really difficult questions about the meaning of Blackness in a world that's so often hostile to it.
Absolutely. This theme reflects the philosophy's roots in, the struggle against anti-Blackness and its engagement with those lived realities of racial oppression. And Afro-pessimism, as articulated by thinkers like Frank Welderson and Saidiya Hartman, that offers this really radical and challenging perspective on Black suffering. It's questioning those traditional frameworks of transcendence, and it involves both ethical and epistemological projects.
So it's about rethinking those fundamental assumptions about how we understand knowledge and ethics in relation to Blackness.
Exactly. And then you have the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And while that emerged from grassroots activism, it can also be understood as philosophy in action, in a way.
Yeah.
It's about directly confronting those philosophical questions about justice, about power, about the very meaning of, Black humanity. And within this theme, the study of Black aesthetics and African-derived cultural practices, that's seen significant growth as well.
Right, because it's not all about struggle, is it? There's also this incredible richness and beauty and joy in Black culture.
Absolutely. And this area recognizes that Black life isn't solely defined by, oppression and resistance. There are these irreducible aesthetic dimensions, and they're really essential to understanding the richness and complexity of, Black experience. And so you see this tension between confronting hardship and celebrating life, and that's a recurring motif in this work. And it connects those contemporary concerns to this long and really vibrant tradition of, Black artistic and cultural expression. From the writings of Frederick Douglass to the Harlem Renaissance to the Negritude movement to the Black Arts movement, and then the work of contemporary scholars like Dzegu and Taylor, for example.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's really clear that Africana philosophy is a vast, dynamic, and incredibly important field of inquiry. It's a way of thinking that's born from, those really profound historical struggles. It's deeply informed by the experience of racialization, yet its insights and contributions extend far beyond simply analyzing race. It's offering those really unique and valuable perspectives on those fundamental philosophical questions that concern us all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've barely scratched the surface here. There are so many more thinkers, so many more ideas that we didn't even get to touch on. From Nzegu's work on institution building to, Winter's incredibly powerful decolonial thought, to Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, to Yancey's critical phenomenology of whiteness, to Asante's development of Africology, to, Curry's work in Black male studies, to Alan Castellito's scholarship on privacy, to the exciting possibilities of Afrofuturism.
It's a whole world unto itself.
It is, and it's constantly growing and evolving.
So, to echo what Outlaw said, this is really just an invitation to further exploration, right? Hopefully, this has sparked some curiosity, made you want to delve deeper into some of these thinkers and ideas.
Absolutely. There's so much to discover.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about how those historical and social contexts, the ones we've been talking about, how they continue to shape philosophical inquiry across all these different domains of thought today, that's something to really consider.
It's crucial, I think, for understanding the world we live in.
So, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.